Okay, so the last video of the year. Thanks for making it this far with me. And I just wanted to go over again, like a way that you can kind of try to deconstruct what you are looking at when it comes to contemporary art. So I'm going to take a slightly in-depth, but not overly long, look at a single artwork called Scramble for Africa by Yinka Shonibare. Yinka Shonibare is a Nigerian artist who is an MBE. He's a member of the British Empire, which is an honor which is bestowed upon only certain individuals, and he is he includes MBE in his name, in his signature, because he finds it quite ironic. So, Scramble for Africa. Let's take a look here and just kind of try to establish what we're looking at. So this is from 2003. It's called Scramble for Africa. So this is something where you may or may not have the historical context for it. And I know that it popped up in my Facebook feed about the Scramble for Africa recently, so you may have seen this, but if not, no worries. So basically, the way that I would suggest you approach something is to simply describe what you see. Don't try to give it a certain meaning. Don't try to interpret it right off the bat. First, just list what you see. So what we're seeing here are, we see 14 figures. These are fiberglass figures. Okay, they're very lifelike. They're mannequins. They are wearing very fancy clothing. They have these very long coats, and the fabric is very brightly colored, and it has lots of patterns. They're sitting in these chairs that look kind of old-fashioned, okay? The figures seem to be discussing something. It looks pretty heated. This figure here has his hand on the individual next to them, this figure, trying to calm them down, right? Like, it's okay, just calm down. Here we have a very accusatory pointing finger. Okay, what else do we notice about these figures? Their skin is a somewhat indeterminate color. It's kind of dark, but it's not white, it's not black, it's not very specifically one or the other. Something else that hopefully you've noticed by now is that all of these figures lack heads. They are all headless, okay? So that's potentially pretty important. And they're gathered around a table. And I've included a detail here, which is this. And if you were to look at this piece in person, you would be able to see this. So I've just taken that piece and popped it up in the corner here. And hopefully y'all are aware that this is a map of Africa, okay? And this is on the conference table where these people are meeting. So if you kind of think through it in that way, right, you can see that these drawings are meant to indicate some of the things that we just talked about. So the lack of heads that we see on these figures, this accusatory gesture, the skin tone, the map of Africa in the middle, these rather old-fashioned chairs, the clothing that these figures are wearing, the colors, okay, the brightness. Now, if you think about the term Scramble for Africa, and this may or may not be something that you know historically, but the Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885, okay, so we're looking at the 19th century, and think about where you might see these kinds of chairs. Would you see these chairs? Is this something that you would expect to see in say maybe Berlin, or might you expect to see it in Nigeria in the 1880s? Where would you see this? These are European chairs. Okay, so the situation is probably Europe, and there's a very heated discussion going on, and it's probably centered on the continent of Africa, since that is on the table, the very center of the table where all of these figures are arguing. Okay, and if you kind of approach an artwork in this way, you can kind of start to isolate the individual elements and start to think through them. So what we're looking at is Yinka Shonibare's depiction of the 1884-85 Berlin Conference, where the powers in the West, so you have England, you have Belgium, right, Germany, all of these various Western nation powers are gathered together and they are dividing Africa. Now, if you look at a map of Africa, it is divided into various nations, but those nations do not necessarily feature where certain people groups live, right? So you have people groups who live in set areas and the nations divide those groups. So this is not drawn according, these lines are not drawn according to where the people groups who live there, who inhabit Africa, are clustered. It is drawn according to what these superpowers wanted. Now, why would you want Africa? Why are they fighting over it? Because of the natural resources available in Africa. Africa has gold. Africa, at this time, has ivory. It has wood. It has rubber. It has people to do work for free. So 1884-85, we're not looking at the transatlantic slave trade anymore. Slavery has been abolished most places, but that does not mean that slavery is not occurring in Africa. So the Victorian powers enslaved the people in Africa, basically, and forced them to work the land. So I mentioned that Belgium is at this conference. So the Belgian King Leopold II, he is the one who led to the Congo area of Africa being called the it is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, but it was the Belgian Congo. And from roughly 1890 to 1910, approximately 5 million people died in the Congo, 5 to 10 million. And the reason that we don't know the actual number is because some of it is starvation. People would flee into the bush. And he enslaved people and forced them to work on his rubber farms. And it is truly, truly ghastly and horrific. There is a book called King Leopold's Ghost, which is very good if this is a topic that interests you. Okay, so getting back to this artwork, right? We see this very, very somber topic, this division of Africa in ways that are completely nonsensical to the people who actually live in Africa, but it's divided according to the powers at the table and the resources that are available in these various areas. So let's look at some of the aesthetic elements. So we have this conference table with these old-fashioned Western chairs. This makes sense. From what you can see of these figures, if they were standing, you would be able to see that this is a Victorian suit, essentially. So these figures are wearing the men's costume of the day from the late 19th century. But what's unusual here is the fabric. Okay, so this type of fabric is known as a batik, and it is most commonly associated with Africa. If you go to the Detroit Africa Festival, which obviously they didn't have this year, but in years past, when you go, they have these really amazing batik fabrics. And a batik is a fabric with typically very bright colors, very bold patterns. It doesn't have to be one of those things, but batik has to do with the way that it's made. And Yinka Shonibare is best known for his use of batiks and these headless figures. So in 1846, Holland, Holland makes an imitation batik fabric. So batik would be made, and I'm a little sketchy on textiles, but you would use wax to delineate areas, and then you would add the colors, etc. But this was a much cheaper version of a batik, and it was simply printed onto the fabric. So Holland is making these based on Indonesian designs, and it's cheaper and it's a lot faster, and they take them to Indonesia, which is at the time called the Dutch East Indies. And you have the trading companies from Dutch, right, the East India Trading Company, etc. And so they bring it to Indonesia, and the people there are like, whoa, this is awful. Like the quality is horrid. No, just no. And so the traders are left with all of this fabric, which is very vivid and garish. It's not something that they can probably sell very well in Holland. And so they take it to Africa. And it's actually sold specifically in Ghana. So Ghanaian soldiers at the time, served in the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army. And so they bring the batik back with them to Ghana. And it ended up really catching on in Ghana and then spreading throughout Africa. And now it is associated with Africa. We see a batik, we think African cloth. And so Yinka Shonibare uses these batiks in his work because when he was in art school, he was making artwork that had to do with the political situation related to the Cold War, Russia, superpowers, etc. And his professor said to him, "Why don't you make African art?" And Yinka Shonibare was just basically pretty gobsmacked because what does it mean to make African art? Who can make African art? Someone from Africa is African, and therefore art that they make is African art. It does not have to be about Africa. It does not have to embody the visual archetypes that we associate with African art. It simply needs to be made by someone from Africa. And so Yinka Shonibare was like, okay, I'm going to adopt the use of batik, which is this seen as African fabric, but it's really not. It's fake Indonesian cloth from the Netherlands that has been adopted by Africa. And so this use of this batik is his way of kind of thumbing his nose at the idea of who can make African art. If you are from Africa, you have to make art about Africa. Think about how constraining that is. So for instance, I'm from Michigan, and if I was told I could only make art about Michigan, that would really limit. Now, obviously, Africa is much bigger and much more diverse than Michigan. But just kind of think about if you had these kind of constraints imposed on you simply because of where you came from. Okay. So much of Yinka Shonibare's best known work features these batiks and the headlessness. Now, what could these figures lacking a head mean in this situation? So the head is where your brain lives. So if you lack a head, you lack a brain. These are brainless figures, right? They're almost automatons, which are like robots who are animated solely by their greed. They lack empathy. They're anonymous. They're completely anonymized. How can you tell who they are? They all have the same skin tone. They lack facial features. There is no hair. These are mindless robots, right? And if you were to read a label about this, etc., you would see that this is the interpretation that Yinka Shonibare has designed this work for. So these figures are fighting for Africa. And the Belgian King Leopold II, who again, I mentioned, absolutely horrific, monstrous person, he said that he called Africa this magnificent cake. And he referred to fighting for a slice of this magnificent cake. That's what he received, a very large portion of this continent, which led to the genocide of millions of people. So keep this in mind as you think about how to approach a work of art. This one is not abstract, so it is somewhat easier, right? But just think about what you're seeing, what the elements that make up what you're seeing are, and what the significance of those could be once you have figured out what it is that you're seeing and what the elements are that make up what you're seeing. To give you another example, we talked in class about the Felix Gonzalez Torres artworks involving candy, right? And so if you look at candy and say that you're looking at one, and I think I mentioned this in class, it was included in a show about the transatlantic slave trade, and it was a rectangle of these blue candies. And so you could pick it up and consume it. And so there's consumption, there's consumerism, right? But then you can also think about what goes into this candy. Sugar, right? The slave trade was absolutely necessary for the sugar plantations in Jamaica and Haiti, right? And so you can kind of break down into its smallest components and from there build a picture of what you might be looking at. So hopefully this was somewhat useful, and I have really, really enjoyed getting to know all of you this semester. And I hope that you have a really good rest of the semester and then a very restful break. So